My guest at this time is Barbara Franklin. She served as Secretary of Commerce in the administration of the late President George Bush. She now heads up Barbara Franklin Enterprises here in Washington, and she joins me to share some personal and professional memories of her time working for President Bush. And Secretary Franklin, thanks very much for your time today.
Oh, thank you for having me today, Greg.
When and how did you first meet George Bush?
I first met George Bush when he was ambassador to the UN, and I was a young White House staff member, and I'm putting that at 1971, 72 time frame. And I'm guessing that the way I met him, although my memory's a little unclear about this, I was at time the recruiter of women for high-level jobs in government, which was the first time any administration had done that. It was President Nixon who was the root of that idea. And I was reaching out to everybody I could find anywhere to help me locate women who may want to come into government in those kinds of positions. And I believe that is how I first met Ambassador Bush. And I thought at the time, I was very struck by his quality of character and his attributes and how he was. He also was fun and funny and high energy, and just was very admiring of him. And then I met Barbara Bush, and I just thought she was perfectly wonderful too. We became friends, and over all these years we're friends. So I feel a sense of personal loss, as well as the loss of a great president and a good man.
How did you cross paths with him again later? Was it during the Reagan years, or was it once he got elected?
No, it was all through. He was the kind of person who collected friends, I think, and they had so many friends everywhere. But no, we just kept in touch over all of those years. And I have some personal notes. In fact, I have a wonderful collection of his handwritten personal notes that go back to 1971, 72, and in through the 70s and the 80s. And then, of course, he became vice president, and we saw them, visited them many times during that era. And then I signed on to his campaign. I really thought he should be president. And that's how it continued. And then served him, was very honored to have served as his Commerce Secretary. But then we're in touch with them as friends over the years since we have all left office, and that's more than 25 years.
And
so a long friendship. I feel very privileged, truly, and honored to have known both of them for as long as I have.
What kind of boss was he? As a hands-on guy, hands-off guy? How would you describe his leadership style?
Leadership style of President Bush was very much the same as his personal style, I would say. Again, the quality of character was very clear. He had principles. He had an ethical, moral sort of a compass. He could be tough-minded, but he was forever gracious. And the combination of being tough-minded and courageous when you needed to be, as well as gracious all the time, is a wonderful example for anyone, and it was for me, and I saw that in him very early, and as a young person, and as a woman who, over the space of my career, faced that kind of dichotomy where some people would say, well, you're not tough enough to do this or that. In fact, some senator who is subsequently retired said that when I became Commerce Secretary. He spoke on the floor that I don't think she's tough enough for this job. And by the way, he later apologized to me and said I was wrong about you. But anyway, those two qualities combined in this great man, I think, made him a leader. And one thing I definitely remember when he asked me to go to China. And this was after he had lost the election in 1992. And the Chinese-U.S. relationship was at a very low point because of the breakdown, or rather the crackdown at Tiananmen Square in 1989. And the economic relationship had stalled. he called me. It was the week after the election, and in his very gracious way, asked me to go to Beijing before we left office. And in so doing, it would take away one of the sanctions that we had on China. The high-level government-to-government contact had been banned. And it would serve to restart the economic relationship, and he wanted that done before we left office. Now, he didn't order me to do it. He asked in his very gracious way, will you please go and do this? And I must say that what went through my mind at the time was, well, why China, why me, and why now? Well, then I didn't verbalize that to him, though, and then he explained that he wanted this relationship restored on a better footing before he left office, so that the new administration could continue to engage in a good bilateral way. He really did a lot, I think, to further the bilateral relationship with China, which, of course, we're having a little rough patch right now, but it's a very important relationship. He did a lot for that, but that illustrates his style. He didn't call and pound the table and say, you must go. He called and graciously asked me to go. And it was my duty, and I went.
The 4 years of the Bush administration had some pretty major moments, both internationally and domestically, to say the least. And oftentimes it's said that you can tell a lot about a person, about how they act, when the pressure is on. So whether it's contemplating the Gulf War or managing the end of the Cold War, dealing obviously with different economic challenges. Japan certainly was a major one at the time. Big debates over NAFTA. We'll get to the tax increases in just a minute. So whenever the pressure was on, did you notice him acting in any different way, or was he pretty consistent?
No, I think he was very consistent. He was to his, and he would say this, to thine own self be true, and I think he was. He behaved the way he thought it was the right way to behave. He really did want to do the right thing for all concerned, and certainly for this country. And I think that's the way, that was his compass, and that was the way he behaved. So no, I don't think he was the kind of person that, had rages or other kinds of, I don't know, down. He may have had his own set of downers on occasion, but he was not that kind of a person who would go up and down, manic and then down. No, I don't think so. I think he was a very steady, calm hand, and I think we were really fortunate that he was, because there was some tough stuff that went on there, and had he not been as calm and steady a leader, things could have been different. But he was, and he made it look, the other thing about him was that he never bragged about it. He made it look kind of effortless, and it wasn't. It wasn't. Ending the Cold War was a very difficult thing to do, which he handled very, very delicately and beautifully. Had he not, again, we could have had a lot more turmoil and difficulty and bloodshed than we did. That was incredible. Now, I am told by some of those who were closest to him when the Gulf War was about to happen, how tough-minded and firm he was about that, and that this abuse of Kuwait had to stop. We had to pull those troops out and stop this kind of annexation. That he was very determined and very tough-minded about it. And although I wasn't in those councils, I believe it, because that's how he behaved, and that's who he was. And as I said, I think we were really fortunate that he was the kind of calm and steady, principled individual, but always gracious and kind about it. Quality of character.
You were, of course, a key member of his economic team. What kind of marching orders did he give you? Oftentimes, the president kind of sets the parameters based on their principles, and then the cabinet secretaries and others kind of fill in the details and pursue policies that will advance those principles. So, what were his major goals when it came to economic growth?
Well, one of the first things he said to me in the meeting we had prior to his nominating me was that he wanted exports to be expanded. So that was a key marching order that I had: increase exports. And that became one of the key goals that I had. And of course, I believe trade is a key part of expanding exports. So we focused on some of those things that would do that. NAFTA fell into that category. NAFTA was under negotiation actually when I came into office, but there were a lot of commerce people who were engaged in all of that. And then my mission to China was the same. We came back with $1 billion worth of signed contracts for U.S. and Chinese companies, and that restarted the export situation with China and restarted the whole economic relationship. We had difficulties with Japan at the time, and some hard-level meetings and negotiations with the Japanese, and I think we made progress on that front too. But that was what it was all about. He was interested in expanding exports and expanding the U.S. economy. Incidentally, I looked up. I did it yesterday because I was curious myself. One of the reasons that I believe he was not reelected in '92 was because there had been a recession in '91, and we had GDP growth that was negative for, I think, 3 quarters. And people were feeling the pain of that. But by 1992, and certainly by the third quarter, that had turned around, and GDP growth was between 3% and 4%. Now, people did not believe it, though, and I think the public didn't feel that the recession was over, but it absolutely was. And there were some people at the time who then, because of course the statistics come out of Commerce, accused me of cooking the books to make things look better. Well, I did no such thing. It was absolutely real, but it just was not yet felt by the American public. And so if then you continue looking at GDP numbers going forward into '93, things really took off. So I felt that he had given the new administration a great present on the way out of office.
We're talking with former U.S. Commerce Secretary Barbara Franklin, served under the late President George Bush. And, of course, one of the other reasons that he perhaps did not win a second term tied into that was the Read My Lips pledge of no new taxes. Then ultimately in 1990, he did agree to new taxes. Former Vice President Quayle just said over the weekend that part of the calculation there was that they knew they had to get money approved by the Congress because they're about to go in to the Gulf War. But ultimately, as you look at the president's decision on the tax increases, what do you remember from the time and the calculations he was making at that point?
I think I would agree that breaking the no new taxes pledge did have something to do with his not being reelected. But what he was doing, I believe, was a matter of principle, because we had some deficits that were mounting. Of course, we should look at that again today, shouldn't we? But and I think that the breaking the budget deal and having these other taxes happen had to do with trying to stave off the bleeding from the deficit in the federal budget. So I think that was a piece of it as well. But I just think breaking the tax pledge was unfortunate. But he did it for reasons of the right reasons of doing the best for the country.
Last question, going back to what you mentioned a little bit earlier in our conversation, Secretary Franklin, and that's the warm friendship that you enjoyed with President Bush and Mrs. Bush for 25 years after the end of the Bush administration. What are some of the most cherished memories that come to mind from those years? Oh,
probably some of the most cherished have to do with being at Kennebunkport at Walker's Point in the summer for a visit and sitting out on the deck there. It's such a beautiful place with a beautiful vista of the sea and the rocky coast, and having lunch, having a conversation. I mean, that's just a priceless kind of memory. I remember sitting in the library with him once at Texas A&M, and having an absolutely, I have a photograph of that here in my office, actually. I can't even remember what was so funny, but all we did was laugh at some set of either memories or jokes or something. But he was like that, you know. He could be funny, and so I remember that, and that's the photograph I have of both of us just cracking up, sitting there in his library at Texas A&M. So there are some many things like this that I can certainly recall. Another element of his graciousness, too, you know, there were times when I was in office and was speaking. One of them was at a U.S.-Russia Business Summit, and he was speaking before I was. And his podium was the one being used. And, of course, he's tall, and so that podium is tall. Well, I'm not tall, but before I was to come to the microphone, he graciously lowered the podium. Now, I'm not sure every person who was in his kind of position would have done that, but that's who he was. Forever gracious and kind.
Thinking of others, not always seen in people of high places. So, Secretary Franklin, you've been incredibly generous with your time today. We thank you so much for that. We thank you for your service to our country and, of course, for helping us look back at an amazing life of President Bush. Thanks for being here today.
Oh, thank you, Greg. Bye-bye.
Former U.S. Secretary of Commerce Barbara Franklin. She now heads up Barbara Franklin Enterprises here in Washington. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.